I'd like to thank everybody for coming today. This is an event that has been long in planning. We have a new website about the relationship of Columbia from the founding of the institution with King's College in 1754 through the Civil War and slavery. And this is something that we have been working on for the past couple of years. I'm going to introduce Eric Foner to also speak, and then we'll have a video, and then we'll hear from two students. Could I just recognize my wife, Jean Mignano-Bollinger? Hun? This originated with a conversation that Eric and I had around the publication of a book on slavery and Ivy League colleges, universities. And that conversation led Eric to take on this task. Really a great, great honor to have Eric Foner and here at the institution, but to do this is spectacular. You just couldn't have a more sophisticated, intelligent, scholarly, but also a public intellectual undertake this assignment. Eric set up a seminar, and the students have also been sterling in trying to uncover this past. We've had faculty, Carl Jacoby and Ty Jones, both take this on from Eric, and we are here today to take this step of having a website documenting this, but also to have a conversation like we're going to have with two students. Let me just say something. This is a work in progress. We are up through the Civil War, as I said. There's still more history and more experience to unpack. We will be doing that. What does this mean? Why is this important to do? Obviously, Columbia is not the first nor the last institution to try to understand itself in this way. I just want to make these comments. I think that the first thing is that if, as we do, want to have people, both our students, our faculty, people who work at the institution, alums, parents, people who are broadly part of what we call the Columbia community, if we want people to identify with this institution, and all the time we are saying, these are great things, really it's important for you to be part of this, we also have the responsibility to look at what's not so good and what perhaps we would even be ashamed of. And so to have an identification with an institution, I think carries a responsibility to be as clear-eyed about that institution as possible. The second thing is that this continues into the present. So one of the things we've learned in the past decade, but unfortunately it's been to learn it over and over again, is that this past is not past. It is very much in the present, and by that I don't mean just that there continues to be racism, discrimination, etc., but that the very past significantly determines how it is today. So that there is a continuity, a blend, and so on. And this matters enormously. As many of you perhaps know, I've been deeply involved in affirmative action and higher education issues for a couple of decades. And it is, in my mind, one of the biggest mistakes that we made in the development of constitutional law in a case called Bakke in the early 80s to separate out the past and what it means for the present as a rationale for educational diversity, and something we made up called the benefits of educational diversity, as if those two things could be separated. And this is a long and difficult argument issue, but it, to me, makes no sense whatsoever to think about constitutional principles or public policies or institutional actions except in the light of what it is that we have today. And what we have today is absolutely and deeply determined by what we've had in the past. This effort is an attempt to try to develop that for our institution, but part of a broader effort to do that. And that's all good because it really brings into sharper focus the thinking that we need for these larger issues that we face in society today. And that is the Equal Protection Clause and affirmative action, but the criminal justice system and other things we know about. So the effort here is not only about Columbia and our community and what we need to know about it, but about the public policies and constitutional law and other things of the United States more generally. So that's, to me, why this is so exciting, important, and I think transformative. And I want to thank Eric Foner personally and on behalf of the institution for guiding us in this effort, and then thank all the students and the other faculty who have helped. Eric?
Thank you very much, President Bollinger, and thanks to all of you for coming this afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here to just introduce, really, the results of our study. It reflects how a university should function, really, and sometimes does. It's a collaboration between students and faculty, staff, and members of the administration, all the different branches of the university, whose purpose, and the purpose of this project is simply to create new knowledge and to disseminate it as widely as possible, with no preconceptions, no biases, and letting the chips fall where they may. And as President Bollinger said, we were certainly prepared to see the less appealing side of Columbia's history as well as its greatness. I particularly want to single out for thanks President Bollinger's office, Susan Glancy, and others for their strong support of the project, Andre LeBoy of the Center for Teaching and Learning, who did all the technical work to create this website, which you will see in a minute as soon as I'm finished. Ty Jones and his colleagues at Rare Books and Manuscripts, the library, who helped us get into the archives of the university and other sources. Mary Freeman and Josh Schwartz, History Department graduate students who did a lot of work digging up documents and images. And especially I want to thank the Columbia and Barnard students in the research seminar that I directed in 2015, that Ty Jones directed last year, and that Carl Jacoby of the History Department is directing right now. They produced these research papers that really form a lot of the basis of the report that we are unveiling. And this is very much an ongoing project, a work in progress. We continue to come up with information about Columbia's historical relationship with slavery, with anti-slavery movements, and the history of race at Columbia. I hope everyone will find the time to take a look at the website and to read the report and the papers of the students. I want to just summarize some of the most important findings. From the beginning of our history as King's College in 1754, slavery was intertwined with the life of this institution and, of course, of New York City. New York was not a plantation region like the Old South, but slavery was an important presence here, certainly before the American Revolution. It was deeply embedded in the life of New York City and New York Colony, and Columbia has always reflected the life of the city that we're in, and slavery is no exception to that. Most of the early presidents owned slaves. Most of the trustees, or the governors as they were called then, as well as donors, were well-to-do merchants whose money came from trade with the West Indies, that is, trade in the products of slave labor, and some of them were engaged in bringing slaves from Africa to the Caribbean and the mainland colonies here. Most of the early students came from families that owned at least one slave. Student research has uncovered numerous newspaper ads in the 18th century by people connected with King's College, ads for the buying and selling of slaves, and ads trying to retrieve or recapture runaway slaves. We don't know how many slaves were present at the college building, which was way downtown at that time, near Trinity Church. We don't know if the college itself owned slaves. We do know that since the early presidents lived in the college and owned slaves, we can assume that their domestic slaves were there also. One undergraduate, John Custis, was brought to study at King's College in 1773 by his stepfather, George Washington. Custis was accompanied by a slave, Joe, who lived in an adjoining room to his in the college and cooked Custis's meals. Washington's stepson didn't last very long at King's College, actually. He seemed to spend most of his time gambling, drinking, and fighting. And after a few months, George Washington came back up to New York to take him home and to take Joe, the slave, along with him. We don't know what happened to Joe after that. We don't know if he gained his freedom or not. In the colonial era, very few white colonists thought that much about slavery. It was simply an accepted fact of part of society. The American Revolution put the question of slavery on the national agenda. King's College closed during the War of Independence. It reopened as Columbia College in the 1780s. Several prominent people connected with the college were active members of the New York Manumission Society, which worked to end slavery in New York State. Alexander Hamilton was one of them. John Jay, another Columbian, was president of the New York Manumission Society. I should note that Hamilton didn't say anything about slavery at the Constitutional Convention, where he was a delegate. Gouverneur Morris, another Columbian who was there, vehemently condemned slavery at the Constitutional Convention. But there's no hip-hop musical about Gouverneur Morris that I know of, so he doesn't get as much attention. But the Jay family is worth looking at for a minute, and of course, we have a dormitory named after John Jay. His son, William Jay, unaccountably went to Yale instead of Columbia, but William Jay's will bequeathed $1,000, a very substantial sum then, to assist fugitive slaves. You will hear from a student, Jared Odesky, shortly about John Jay II, the grandson of the Chief Justice John Jay, who was a Columbia student, graduated in the 1830s, and became a very active abolitionist, fighting in New York City against slavery in the South, and also trying to going to court to assist fugitive slaves who ended up in New York. You'll hear from Jared about him. I just would point out that John Jay II's efforts to help people fleeing from oppression and trying to find refuge in New York City and opposing national policy in relation to this has become sort of uncannily relevant in the last few days, and his efforts are certainly something that we can be proud of as an institution. But Jay was not typical. Most Columbians seem to have been fairly indifferent to the slavery issue before the Civil War. Those who did deal with it mostly joined the Colonization Society in the 1820s and 30s, which was devoted to gradually ending slavery, but also sending the whole black population, former slaves and free African Americans, to Africa. William Dewar, the president of Columbia in the 1830s, was also president of the New York Colonization Society and was roundly condemned by leaders of the free black community of New York City. As the Civil War grew nearer, anti-slavery flourished more at Columbia, anti-slavery sentiment. In the 1850s, the President Charles King was a strong opponent of slavery. During the Civil War, the leaders of Columbia College rallied to the support of the Union war effort, although one chemistry professor, Richard McCullough, who was from Virginia, returned to his home state in order to try to devise chemical weapons that the Confederacy could use. But other Columbians, such as President King, trustee George Templeton Strong, and professor of political science Francis Lieber, were active members of the Union League and the Loyal Publication Society, and promoted support for emancipation, support for the arming of black soldiers in the Union Army. Columbia had almost no Southern students before the Civil War, unlike, for example, Princeton, where half the student body resigned in 1861 to go and join the Confederate Army. On the other hand, very few Columbia students actually enlisted in the Union Army. Whether they were wise or cowardly is people can decide for themselves. Our project, as right now, ends in 1865 with the end of the Civil War. But as was mentioned, it's ongoing. I hope and expect it will move forward into the late 19th century, the early 20th century, to trace out the history of race at Columbia in terms of students, faculty, administrative policies, etc. There's much more to this report. I urge you to take a look at the website for greater detail and a big array of documents and images and papers by students. I just want to conclude by noting that other universities are also investigating their historical connection to slavery, but I think Columbia is definitely taking the lead in developing a candid appraisal that highlights the centrality of slavery and racial inequality in the history of the United States and in the deep history of our own institution. Now, at this point, we were going to show this little video before, but we didn't, so I want to say maybe right now we can show the video of the website. Is that correct, whoever is the organizer now? Okay, so thank you for listening, and then there will be a discussion with two of the great students who produced research here.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Christopher Brown in the history department here, and we're going to have a conversation with two of the contributors to this project, Jordan Brewington and Jared Odesky. I just want to say first, before we start our conversation, that if you get a chance to look at the website and the student papers that are on it, I think you will be impressed by how substantive and full they are. These are original works of scholarship. They're contributions to knowledge, not just to the history of Columbia, but to the history of slavery in the North, the history of capitalism, the history of African American life. They're really impressive papers, much more than term papers. Much more than if you're merely just trying to get an A in a course. These are clearly labors of love. And it shows what happens, I think, when you have clear leadership and direction from the top, first-rate instruction and mentoring, exceptional institutional archives, and talented and dedicated students working at the very top of their abilities. So let's hear first from Jordan, and then we'll hear from Jared.
Hi, my name's Jordan Brewington. I'm a senior in Columbia College, and I was in the seminar See You in Slavery led by Ty Jones and Mary Freeman last year. So I'm just going to jump into what my research project was about. I did an in-depth analysis into which King's College and Columbia students owned slaves and submitted runaway slave advertisements, as you saw on the website, to their local newspapers between the founding of the institution in 1754 to actually about 1805. And so before I sort of get into the main goals of my project, the reason why I jumped into this project was because of my personal connection to this work. When I went into the seminar, I had a very clear dream about tracing sort of enslaved labor on Columbia's campus, and talked about that a lot with Ty and Mary. But what ultimately came down to was primary source work, which I'm going to talk to you now about, which was runaway slave advertisements. So for those of you who don't know, runaway slave advertisements were advertisements that were submitted by white slave-owning men, women, or their representatives to local newspapers in an attempt to recapture people who had managed to escape forced bondage. And so the way that that looked was it was typically an advertisement that describes what an enslaved man or woman last looked like, their appearance, and then it presents a monetary reward for that person. And these advertisements, as was mentioned before, were very commonplace. So often you would see these advertisements in the same sentence as an advertisement for a piece of furniture, often next to advertisements for land or candy. These were commonplace. And something that really interested me was not only the fact that they were very regular, but also the fact that they were some, if not only, not the only type of literature that was widely published in public that was singularly about Black life. And that's sort of what was my passion, was I wanted to come at this specifically from the perspective of Black enslaved people. So like I said, I sort of had two main goals for my project. And the first was sort of going off of what Professor Foner was just saying, deconstructing this narrative of white unconsciousness to the atrocities that they were profiting from. So I felt like when I was young, and maybe when we were all young learning about history, it seemed like, and history around slavery, it seemed like there was constantly the story of how white Americans really weren't cognizant of the atrocities that they were committing. They were simple or just weren't really thinking about it. And sort of what I wanted to do was deconstruct that, discuss how King's College and Columbia students were actively engaged and knowledgeable about what they were doing and how they chose to end up ignoring the humanity of their own slaves for their own profit. And then the second goal that I really wanted to get across in my paper was this real undercurrent of Black resistance that's going on that you can see through these runaway slave advertisements. You can see through fugitivity, looking at fugitivity as a means of resistance. So what I end up talking about is how running away was not only just destruction of property, but also was really cracking the facade of a stable slave system, was really shaking the consciousness. And so I'll just quickly share how I did that. I broke down my paper thematically into themes: appearance, which is like clothing, language, skin complexion. I talked about selling slaves, which is not necessarily a runaway slave advertisement, but which is important in understanding how these white men who were attending King's College were actively profiting off of this trade. I also talk about return runaways. So it's a very specific, and I'll speak more about that now, sort of a very specific branch of runaway slave advertisements that were essentially resubmitted over several years, which sort of ends up showing that there were people who were consistently running away from the same person. And I think that really goes back to those two goals that I was talking about. One, the consciousness of those white slave owners, knowing time and time again that these people are running away, seeking self-determination, seeking a life for themselves, and continually trying to recapture them. But then also this undying resistance, this undying faith and desire for freedom that you really get in there. And then the last section of my paper, let's see, we have runaways. What do we have? We have, I forgot the last one. Oh, signs of brutality and violence. So in my paper, I end up exploring how approximately 26 affiliates submit a total of 44 advertisements. And I basically just talk about how out of those 44, 21 of them discuss signs of brutality and violence. So that can be anything from Henry Izard, class of 1767, I believe, branded, or discusses in a runaway slave advertisement about a slave who was branded Izard on her left cheek, anything from that to missing toes, things like that, really deeply troubling things that discuss the day-to-day abuse that was going on that these students were aware of and was part of this general world. So that was just generally what my topic is about.
That's great. Thanks, Jared.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Jared Odeski. I'm Columbia College class of 2015, and I was in Professor Foner's inaugural Columbia University and Slavery seminar. As Professor Foner mentioned, this investigation is not just about slavery, the institution, but also anti-slavery movements, which were quite diverse. They included manumission, gradual emancipation, colonization, as well as abolition. And somewhat unfortunately, Columbia, as an institution, has a very weak link pre-Civil War with immediate abolition. And so my investigation was into John Jay II, who was Columbia College class of 1836, and his anti-slavery and anti-racist activism, both as a student and throughout his career and engagement with the Episcopal Church, the Diocese of New York. As Professor Foner mentioned, John Jay II was the grandson of John Jay I, founding father, first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and King's College class of 1754. So first, I look into John Jay II's involvement with this type of activity as a student. It seems he comes to Columbia already with anti-slavery views. Of course, his grandfather, John Jay, was a member of the Manumission Society. His father, William Jay, is also an abolitionist. And so it seems he learns much of this anti-slavery activism at home. A Columbia College student in the 1830s was not engaging in any discussion of slavery. They were taking a few credits in Latin and Greek, in mathematics, and maybe by their third or fourth years, engaging with humanities. But Columbia professors at the time, from what we were able to dig up, were not necessarily discussing anti-slavery activism. William Dewar, who was actually president of Columbia College, was one of John Jay II's professors and actively preached colonization in the classroom. John Jay II also didn't learn about anti-slavery on campus necessarily, or at least about immediate abolition. He engaged in the Philalexian Society, but the Philalexian Society, which was one of the main debating groups on campus, had actually voted down a vote in favor of abolitionism in 1816. He went on his senior year to found the Alpha Delta Phi Society, of which I know Jordan is a member, which exists to this day and is the only place on campus where a picture of John Jay II is actually displayed on the staircase. And that may be seen as an attempt to sort of diversify the discussion among campus student groups. But Jay II did found, while he was in college, the New York Young Men's Anti-Slavery Society, which was specifically devoted to immediate abolition. He also engaged with Columbia and Columbians as a churchman in his involvement in the Episcopal Church. Columbia and the Episcopal Church had very close ties dating back to the Episcopal Church's origins as part of the Church of England, as well as Columbia's origins as King's College. So, as a churchman, John Jay II was engaged in pushing the church toward anti-racist activism and abolition. He actually actively pushed for the Episcopal Church to issue a resolution in support of abolition. And he also, in two other ways, sought to create an anti-racist view of the Episcopal Church. First, with the case of Alexander Crummell, who was a black student who was denied entry into the General Theological Seminary. He appealed to Bishop T. Onderdonk, Columbia class of 1831, who rejected Crummell's admission into the theological seminary. And also, he actively advocated for St. Philip's Church, a black parish, to have admission into the Protestant Convention. And finally, as a lawyer, John Jay II engaged in anti-racist activism, this time with involvement with physicians and surgeons, which in 1860 became Columbia College's medical school. And he pushed for James Parker Barnett, who was a physicians and surgeons student, to have his expulsion from the school rescinded. The expulsion had come about because it was suddenly discovered in his third year that he was a colored student. So I think that John Jay II, John Jay, we know the name on campus. He has a dining hall named after him, a residential hall, JJ's Place for all the undergraduates in the room, as well as an annual alumni awards dinner. John Jay II was our immediate abolitionist, and I think his story needed to be told.
That's great, thank you. So I want to ask you both first about, so you've told us a little bit about the outcomes of your research. I want to take you back to the beginning of the semester when you were working on this, and as you framed the questions that you were interested in and started the initial archival work. I'd like to know what first caught you off guard, surprised you, took your breath away. What aspect of the history, because you would have gone in thinking, okay, well, Columbia has some ties to slavery or anti-slavery, but then every historian has that encounter with the material. It's like, okay, this is not quite what I was anticipating. And you two have been rustling around in the institutional archives. pursuing these questions. So tell us a little bit about a moment where that occurred, where you're sort of like, wow, story is more complicated, more interesting. It's different from what I anticipated.
I would say after our first class, I think it was maybe after the class that we went to RBML, I went on my own. And two things really struck me. First, the fact that we can touch these documents, that really brought it home for me. So when I touched a slave inventory, it was like, so basically an inventory with a lot of different furniture and all these things, then human beings at the end with value. It was very, very heavy and hard for me. But it grounded me. It reminded me that this was real, and that I'm real, and that this issue is real. So I think that was one thing. Another thing, like I said before, that this is personal work for me, and that I specifically wanted to talk about this history, specifically enslaved Black lives, and sort of instead of talking about white slave owners or even white abolitionists, understand history through something other than a white eye. And it was really difficult because of the lack of documentation. I mean, I just was talking to you about the fact that I can't find who was working at our original campus. It's something that eats at me all the time. But just sort of the lack of primary documentation that is a slave narrative or just a free Black narrative, which I think speaks to something, the reason why it's not there anymore. But that was what really got to me.
Sure. So I wasn't interested when I signed up for this seminar necessarily writing a positive story, and I don't think I did. When I actually looked back at why I chose John Jay II as a research topic, I think John Jay II stands out because he is sort of a lone wolf. And what really surprised me was actually the lack of engagement of the rest of Columbia College students and Columbia affiliates at this time. So I think we can look to John Jay II as an example to compare to the extremely conservative attitudes of Columbia College students and affiliates at that time. And I think another surprise, certainly related to that, was just how everyday slavery was, talked about, the everyday language that was used. It was sort of an after fact of life. And Columbia's history with slavery is not necessarily as directly engaged as Georgetown, for instance, which sold 272 slaves in order to keep the university's finances afloat. I think for Columbia, it's really looking into where does slavery and anti-slavery activism pop up in the marginalia. This is something that you wouldn't necessarily see on the surface or talked about directly.
So, Jordan, you've spoken very eloquently about the limits of the sources, like wanting to know who was on campus and what they were doing. And yet, I read your, the report that's on the website, and I think you do get a sense of some of the humanity, the individuality, the experience, if not voice. It does seem like you come out with a little bit of a picture of who these men and women were who were enslaved to Columbia affiliates. So who were they?
Oh, gosh. Well, let's begin with sort of the world. So we're talking about how it's very daily. Every day you're seeing these advertisements in the paper, and this is sort of what I'm doing my thesis work on right now. But understanding that Columbia wasn't the way that we see it now. We weren't on a campus in the same way, at least when you're looking at Park Place, which is the campus near Trinity Church. So you were having enslaved people working in the area, building homes, building streets, and I believe building the campus, though I don't know, so I can't say.
So it's the whole milieu. In and around the college is just embedded in slave experience, slave life circulating in and out of the early college.
And also free Blacks. So that's something that really struck me as interesting. So for instance, if you look at, in my paper, I talk about how, I like to make a sense about how Philip Livingston, who's like the founder and in many ways one of the founding families, on the census it says that he has 12 slaves living in his household, and down the street there's a free family, which you can denote via the census. Sometimes it'll show just a first name of a head of a household, and then it'll say there are a few people who are living there. So you can make you can assume that was probably a free black family that was living there. So think about this environment. You have enslaved black people, you have free black people, and you have white male students who are going to the school every day. What does that look like? How does that feel? And in what ways is this campus, though it's very different and times are different, in what ways is this campus similar and or different?
It makes you think about the ways that part of what makes a college and a university, right, is not only what's going on inside of it, but what's also happening immediately around it. And I think your project really helps us think about that. Okay, so I have to ask you, so here we have John Jay, a man named John Jay, who is the grandson of the founder, Chief Justice, who's so important to Columbia's history. He is Columbia's, it seems, only radical abolitionist to have emerged from the 19th century, and yet nobody has ever written about it. So, I mean, how do you make sense of that? I mean, it's one thing for an institution to want to not talk about its slaveholders, but I think Columbia might be the first one that's not want to talk about its abolitionists. So, how do you make sense of that?
So, I think John Jay II has actually been written about relatively extensively. Certainly not to the extent that John Jay I has been, but I was working with actually several secondary sources. I think the interesting, project that we were taking on was how does this relate specifically to Columbia? We were taking a history that's already been told. We know the history of slavery. We know a lot of these actors already. I think the question was, well, how is Columbia involved in this? And for me, that was looking at how John Jay II was engaging with Columbia as an institution and Columbians within, the history that has, for the most part already been told, and then going back to the primary sources and seeing, where does Columbia or King's College stick out here?
I stand corrected. So apparently there is a lot of work on John Jay. These guys are already better historians than we are. So tell me a little bit about how this experience affects your picture of Columbia now. So having taken this seminar, what's your feeling, your perception of the history of the institution? How has it shaped your sense of this place after having completed this work?
I think it's made my relationship with the institution more complex. I mean, it's very obvious if you look at me, like, I'm a black woman about to be an Ivy League graduate, navigating an Ivy League institution where students once owned slaves, and I'm a descendant of slaves. That's very difficult to wrangle with. But in terms of what this seminar has done for me and like what the research has done for me, it's given me some sort of clarity. It's become the focus of my life. It's like what I care about. And I think, how do I feel about this institution? I mean, I'm glad that this exists. I'm glad that we know about it. I can't say I'm glad that it happened, obviously. But I think my goal moving forward is letting other people know about it, because it's brought so much clarity to my day-to-day life and complexity as I'm working through things. But I mean, like I was talking to you about before, like we're in Low, and so we're all Columbia affiliated, but what about all the people right outside of our walls? That's who I want to know about this work, because I think that it really affects them too.
I think that it solidified my view that no institution operates neutrally in the world, and that includes Columbia. And I think there has been growing recognition of that. The same year that my seminar students and I were, the fellow students and I were engaging in this discussion, there was a very active discussion on campus about divestment from the private prison industry, which actually was granted in subsequent months. And I think we, throughout the entire class, talked about issues like mass incarceration and how this pops up today. I think going back to the source material, you see so much discussion about how the institution, whether it's Columbia or the Episcopal Church, should not be engaged in the issues of the day. That the Episcopal Church is about religion. It's not about the question of abolition. Columbia College is a place to learn Latin and Greek. It's not a place to talk about slavery. And I think seeing how that was wrong in the past really made me think about how that can be wrong today.
That's great. I wonder also, so we've talked a little bit, mostly actually about Columbia and your experience as Columbia students and what it means for Columbia's history. But obviously this is taking place also in thinking about the history of slavery just more generally. And I wonder, by taking this particular slice of it, whether you come out of it with a different understanding of slavery in the North, in the United States. It's a slightly, it's an unusual point of entry, given the fact that we tend to think of the history as part of a colonial history, a part of a Southern history, perhaps part of a Caribbean history. So we know it's part of a New York history too. That's not especially new, but the way that you've come into it is actually an unusual angle. And I wonder if you're thinking about what we need to know next in the history of slavery has been affected or shaped by this.
I think Jared was already sort of speaking about this before, but I think sort of why this, I feel like it's like why this all matters, or like in order to move forward, comes down to sort of the clarity that I was also just talking about. So what I hope for the future of this project is that people see the facts, and once you see the facts and understand that it's not just evil individuals, but that it's a world, you start to understand how that world ended up birthing the world of 2017. And once you do that, I think you end up asking yourself the question of, well, who would I have been in that world? Well, who am I in this world, and is there a difference? Like, that to me is all I want from everyone. I mean, you could leave this building today and be like, well, I don't really care about what had happened in the past, but as President Bollinger was saying, what happened in the past birthed what happens today, and how we navigate and how we know our power and position in day-to-day life.
I think our course was in some ways a study of slavery in New York City. There's the popular idea that the North was not complicit in slavery as an institution, which we know, of course, there were slaves in the North up through the Revolution and then past. But the students at Columbia College and at King's College were, as Craig Wilder has written about in his book, Ebony and Ivy, the sons of merchants. And merchants were based in New York City, didn't necessarily own slaves by the mid-19th century, but were actively financing the slave trade. And so you begin to see how New York City played a central role in perpetuating the system of slavery, how the North was still a very racist place, even if slavery was not, directly and physically there. So I think that, it's not just a study of Columbian slavery, but really how Columbia fits into a larger picture of slavery.
So we have a little bit of time to take questions from all of you about the project, about the specific findings of these students, about the broader context for the history of Columbia, history of slavery. I think there are microphones. There's one coming down the aisle here. There may be another one at some point. So we'd very much like to hear what's on your mind.
Thank you guys so much for putting all of this on. My question was, as you were doing this project, to what extent did you collaborate with the Teachers College, who has created the Columbia's Mapping the African American Past project, or how do you guys see yourself collaborating with them in the future going forward with this project?
Could you say again what the Teachers College what?
Mapping the African American Past. If you search for that, you'll see that they have different historical sites all throughout New York City where slavery has been important, right? So like spots on the Underground Railroad, spots where slaves used to own land, Seneca Village, all of that. So I didn't know if you guys collaborated with them while you were working on this project.
I haven't collaborated with them, but I think the idea of putting this information online in map form, that's what my thesis is on. Like, I think that's really brilliant in terms of getting people to interact with it. But I don't know if your group did.
I think it is a typical Columbia problem of balkanization, where there's so many resources and they're spread across the institution. But I did use mapping to look at specifically the house of Alexander Tappan, who was an abolitionist who Jay helped save his house in a fire during the 1834 riots against abolitionists and against anti-slavery activists. So I think mapping is incredibly helpful, especially since we're looking at New York City and the area is so dense.
I'll also just say that a promising aspect of this project is that it's not closed.
Yes.
So we've had, I guess this is the third iteration of it this semester. And my guess is that 5-6 years from now, we'll know a lot more, both about this institution's history, but also its relationship with respect to slavery and race to other institutions in the neighborhood and perhaps in the region. So I think we're very much on the front end of this. And as Professor Foner was indicating, this is very much the beginning of a conversation rather than the end of a story.
Okay. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Hi. Thank you guys for your work. This is amazing to watch. You guys are an inspiration to all of us who are sitting here. So my question is, you guys have been talking about future steps you see for the project, where this research will go. But have you guys also thought about other ways you can make this known to the campus? So recommendations for other ways that Columbia can continue to grapple with this, that go beyond just the research and the website aspect of it?
So I think for me, I was looking at John Jay II and, comparing him to John Jay I's presence on campus and saying, well, we should rename one of these John Jay's John Jay II, the JJ2's place in John Jay Hall. But I think that, we need to be thinking about how to memorialize this, perhaps physically on the campus. That was a big question I had. I don't know if John Jay II is necessarily the right person to memorialize. I think that, as Jordan has researched, slaves were, the results, the main reason why anti-slavery activism was happening. I think, I was not seeking to glorify John Jay II as much as to reveal how his classmates and affiliates were complicit in the atrocities of slavery. And I think, that is an interesting question, how we mark slavery's presence in history on the campus.
I think there needs to be something, hi Camilla, I think there needs to be something about educating our freshman class. So Professor Jacoby is my thesis advisor also, as well as the CU in Slavery seminar teacher. And we've talked about how Brown used to do that. When Brown's report first came out, a lot of the incoming class had to read that. I think that would be wonderful if the incoming class had to read that. Someone in the seminar last Thursday was saying how it's important for people to know what they're getting themselves into. Because when we come to Columbia, all we're taught really, or at least all that I remember, was like the Iliad, and like we're gonna be scholarly, it's gonna be amazing. But at what point do we reckon with the past of this institution, the past that we are all going to be a part of in the present day? So yeah, I hope I answered your question.
Thank you.
Hi, my question is actually very similar, so thank you for asking yours. I'm actually a student at Melman, and I went here for undergrad, MCC 2011. And thank you all for speaking and sharing your research. So my question was, how does this research change how you see the core curriculum at Columbia and ways to bolster the overall Columbia education? And I say this as not only as an alum of Columbia College, but also when I was on campus, I was very involved in founding a student organization called the African Diaspora Literary Society. And it was a direct response to my experience as a Black person, a woman, and being at Columbia's campus and not feeling that my history and people who look like me were told in the core curriculum and Columbia in general. So I know it's a really loaded question, but again, it ties to her question. But how does it change the way you see the core and other thoughts you have?
I feel like one thing is simply researching more about the core's founding. Like that's a huge thing that we're talking about doing for this seminar this year. Figuring out, we know a lot about the core's founding because of the Columbia.edu website, and we have a core office and all of these things. But who's teaching it? What were the underlying reasons for that? So I think that would be first before you sort of get into in which ways are we going to ameliorate the core. My Lit Hum professor is actually here today, and the little things I think that were even done in your class, Professor Verser, were changing what we read. We read A Mercy by Toni Morrison, just like beginning that work of just altering individual books, but also the research has to take place as to where it came from first, and sort of working top down in that way. I hope that answered your question.
Oh, thank you.
I think I would agree completely with Jordan. I think, uncovering the roots of the course development is critical to understanding how and if to change it. I think that, there's also been discussion about adding studies of race and ethnicity into the core curriculum, which I think uncovering some of that history, would certainly bring that conversation to the fore again, which I think would be a positive thing.
Thank you.
James?
Thank you so much for sharing all of this. I was actually a TA for the first original class under Professor Foner, and so it's great to see how this has sort of blossomed. My question, because I read your paper, Jerry, my question is for Jordan. I'm interested in what is this sort of, if you could thread together the various runaway ads in relation to, and it's probably in your paper, so I should probably read that, but I'm just curious. What type of fugitive world do you hold that folks are mapping? Like, is there something about their vision that you can gather especially from the consistent runaways that you're talking about?
What do you mean by fugitive? Could you just say the last part again?
What is their sort of what sort of fugitive world is being mapped in their actions of running away? Like where are folks running to? How does it sort of index their vision for a different world?
I think I'm just going to talk about secondary source work. I mean, people within New York City that I've read about are often running to loved ones. Trying to reconnect families that are being torn apart. People are running from down up into New York. I think specifically more and more as we get closer to the Civil War, people are moving up here because there's just this amalgamation of people and there's a shot at freedom maybe here. What I talk a lot about in my paper, though, is how that fugitivity is a political act. So I think often, like when people talk about fugitivity and running away, they're sort of thinking of it as something that's not calculated, something that just is like, I'm just gonna go. And maybe sometimes it is that immediate, but I'm talking about it more as like a real act of resistance that can be documented. So if you read my paper, that's what I'm exploring. And that act of resistance happening in the face of just awful oppression on a day-to-day basis. So if you read it, I'll talk about Mingo, like I said in the paper, and how Mingo, he's the starter in the end of my paper. And by the way, his name obviously is not Mingo, that's his slave name. But I talk about how this was a person who ran away not only from one Columbia University affiliate, but from two, Isaac Wilkins and Samuel Ogden. And I found both of their individual runaway slave advertisements, but I also found a runaway slave advertisement they published in 1771 in the Philadelphia Chronicle together about this one person. And like I said, going back to those two goals, what does that mean in terms of white consciousness, and what does that mean in terms of black resistance? And like pairing those two goals together in this ultimate story of King's College relationship to slavery and the slave trade, and slavery in New York.
Thank you.
Here.
Thank you very much for your talk. This question is more towards Jordan as well, along the same lines as the refugee slaves. But is there like some sort of connection to the view of property that dominates the 19th century?
Wait, say again.
Thank you. Is there some sort of connection to the view of the 19th century slavery where slaves are property and they do whatever they like with their property that connects with this lack of consciousness about property that exhibited by this exhibit of Mingo in Columbia?
Could you expand on what you mean? So I understand you're saying slaves are viewed as property, but...
So these slaves are brought back and recovered as property, and they attempt to escape again. So of course they're in some similar physical condition where they are physically able to do so. So is there a more preservative thought process of ownership of slaves by these Colombian owners, or is it similar? Because you mentioned the dismemberment as well in your paper. So I was just...
I'm not so sure if I can directly answer your question, but what I will talk about when I'm talking about like returning slaves and all of that, I'm sort of trying to illustrate an entire world where like this is regular. And when I talk about like signs of brutality and violence, whether it's branding, whether it's deformities, this is the world that King's College and Columbia students are living in. So for Henry Izzard, that's really interesting that it was his name there, but to them, sometimes they receive this property, human beings like us, with missing toes, with like maybe mental disabilities or physical disabilities. But yeah, it's all, I would say, as I'm trying to detail in my work, that it's all a part of this like normalcy that I find to be deeply disturbing and that I want to bring out in my paper.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Christian?
This is your fault, Jordan.
Oh my God.
I'm Christia Mercer, and I was actually very lucky to have Jordan in my Lit Hum class. I was at the time chairing Literature Humanities and actually quite eager to include greater diversity in the course. I'm quite impressed by the fact that, for example, Columbia is the only private institution to divest from the private prison obscene circumstance. Eric Foner is doing this great work. Lee Bollinger is supporting this really important work. And I guess what I want to say really, and Jordan in particular can respond, but I'm really very surprised by the extent to which students haven't pushed a bit more for a greater diversity of the core. I mean, students are very eager and they really want to do that, but I think a lot of professors are a little bit old-fashioned in the sense they want to teach what they've been teaching. So as former chair of Literature Humanities, as former professor of Jordan and many other wonderful students, I just say that if students actually were to kind of use this wonderful and important study to ask the core to reconsider itself somewhat and see the core as, I mean, one way of putting it is this: every single generation of teaching the core has reinvented the core. And we are now a new generation, or you folks are now a new generation, so why shouldn't we reinvent the core in ways that speak to these historical facts and also the contemporary circumstance of today? So my kind of radical suggestion is that students have more power than they think they do, and they need to be the people who help us push through some of the changes that are a little bit slow in coming.
That's so powerful. Thank you, Professor.
I think we can take one more question.
Hi. As we leave Low Library, there'll be a protest or a rally outside against the immigration ban, and I hope many of you will join it. My question is, how does the work that you've done looking at Columbia at a time when it was definitely on the wrong side of history, or when the people at Columbia were on the wrong side of history, influence the way that you think Columbia, and especially as privileged students, because we're all privileged to be here, should act in today's America?
So you're asking how, wait, what are you asking?
Sorry.
I'm so sorry.
I suppose my question is really, how has the research that you've done about Columbia's past influenced the way that you think Columbia should operate today?
Got you.
Including its students and the administration.
This is sort of what I meant when I was saying, thinking about concepts of worlds and asking who would I be in that world. If I'm talking about just Columbia undergraduates and you're talking about, like these privileged people who go to the school, really critically thinking about who would I be in that world. I've shared my research with you and with many of my other friends, and often like the quick reaction is shock. It's like, wow, I can't believe that people were so simple and not critical of their environment, and I would never do that. I think that's something that I hear a lot, without realizing that a lot of the people who we interact with, if placed in that environment, might have been that way. You have to understand, like, instead of vilifying individuals, recognizing how a whole lot of individuals were believing that black people were naturally inferior. I don't remember if it's John Jay, your John Jay, or the John Jay before your John Jay, who were both exemplary people, especially your John Jay. And how, I can't remember which one of them was saying, I was reading in a book, believe that black people were only probably not naturally inferior. Use the quotes, probably. Think about that. Like, I'm not trying to attack John Jay in any way, but just think about the fact that this person who really did a lot of work potentially on behalf of these people still felt this individual inferiority in their head. So I think in terms of interacting with students in the present day, being self-critical, listening, read Ebony and Ivy, understanding ways in which you could have been that person. I could have been a different person in that world, and like really sitting with that for a while. I hope I answered you.
Yeah, I think that while not perfect, John Jay II provided an example of what a good Columbian should be, which is someone who is both engaged in the world, but also engaged on campus and in trying to talk to their peers and engage in conversation with them. So on campus, he wasn't happy with his offerings, and he started a new organization. He was involved during his college years, not just within the campus gates, but also in founding a society outside of it, and then engaging his peers throughout his life. I think he is someone that in my research I look to as something I would hope to be.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that's interesting about him actually is it seems like his activism arises as much out of his frustrations with Columbia than anything he actually learned at Columbia.
That's right.
And it seems like the source of his activism is the reaction to his education. So I think we're going to have to wrap up. Thanks to you both for wonderful papers. Thank you, Eric, for the project, and Lee for your support. Thanks for all of you for coming out. Look at the website. And for those of you who are not taking the course yet, you're underclassmen, take the course and contribute to it. Thank you.